Good evening to everyone present here. Thank you for joining us today. This is the ninth panel session for this year's edition of Creative Theory Colloquium. After 2.5 days of discussion on various themes and issues at India International Center, we have now shifted to the online mode to engage in more intellectual brainstorming. The title for this session is Democracy, Rights and Resistance. The session will be chaired by Dr. Biswajit Mohanty, who teaches political science at Deshbandhu College, University of Delhi. His specializations include border studies and election studies. Dr. Mohanty is also the coordinator for this session. The first speaker for the session will be Professor Gopal Pradhan, who teaches at Ambedkar University in Delhi. Gopalji has done his higher education from Banaras Hindu University and Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has done English to Hindi translation of some very reputed books and has written and edited a number of books on Marxism. The next speaker for this session will be Dr. Maya John, who teaches history at Jesus and Mary College, University of Delhi. She is a prominent social activist who has been writing on issues of labor, health, education, gender, social movements, transformative politics, and social theory. Her recently published works include a co-edited volume, Who Cares? Care Extraction and the Struggles of Indian Health Workers and Debating Education in India, Issues and Concerns. She is also the convener of Delhi NCR Union of Domestic Workers, Gharelu Kamgar Union. The next speaker for the session will be Professor Bajrang Bihari Tiwari, who teaches in the Hindi department of Deshbandhu College, University of Delhi. बजरंग जी भक्ति काव्य तथा भारतीय दलित आंदोलन और मूलक साहित्य के गंभीर अध्येता के रूप में चर्चित हैं. Some of the books that he has published are titled हिंसा की जाति, जातिवादी हिंसा का सिलसिला, जाति और जनतंत्र, दलित उत्पीड़न पर केंद्रित, भारतीय दलित साहित्य, आंदोलन और चिंतन, and there are many other books as well. The next speaker for the session will be Vaibhav Das, who is a senior research scholar in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Delhi. Vaibhav is also an incoming Fulbright Nehru doctoral research scholar. Their doctoral thesis is titled Transformative Citizenship, Social Change and Democracy, a sociological study of the electoral exclusion of transgender persons in India. They are researching at the intersections of data, cultures, law, gender, and sexuality in the making of histories and policies for LGBTQIA plus persons in India. The last speaker for the session will be Dr. Nikhil Jain. He is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, Dayal Singh College, University of Delhi. He was the first disabled elected academic council member of University of Delhi from December 2010 to January 2015. Moreover, he was instrumental in making Delhi University accessible and friendly for disabled through several progressive efforts like ensuring reservation for disabled in teaching and non-teaching jobs, having a disability policy in DU, first exam writing policy for disabled in 2011, increase in the reservation of seats from 3 to 5% for disabled in hostels, etc. He has presented papers on issues like rural development, rights of disabled in various conferences and seminars. He has also contributed a chapter titled Physically, Mentally Challenged in the book titled Weapon of the Oppressed, an inventory of people's rights in India. His articles have been published in Economic and Political Weekly, the Hindu newspaper, and the Critique magazine. Each speaker will get 20 to 25 minutes to speak, followed by the comments from the chair and then questions and answers round. I request the audience to keep their mics on mute to avoid any disturbance. I now hand over the proceedings to the chair. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you to the Democracy, Social Movements, and Human Rights session. I must state at the outset that the 10th Creative Theory Colloquium has engaged with very important and contemporary issues. And this panel is a little different in the sense that it brings insights from the grassroots level and examines the traditional issues and tensions inherent in them, especially in a new liberal political setup. Uh, Let me begin with the concept of democracy and democratic institutions. As you know that the traditional democratic theorists, they think of democratic society structure in terms of the constitution, the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, and the press. Uh, Maintaining the system of democratic setup requires the institutions to retain a semblance of division of power among the institutions. So that is basically a separation of power, and it's a federal setup where units get adequate power to govern themselves. And the second aspect of this theoretical plank is the presence of uh, plural pressure groups who, through lobbying and persuasion, try to incorporate their interest into policy agenda. This actually depoliticizes the public sphere and people themselves. If we define democratic politics simply as a competition among claims, then it does much damage to democracy as it gradually slides people into cynicism. And if politics is only about deliberation through media narrative, then the discourse engenders a fragmented public life where people give the audience only the argument of their groups. So this means that people cannot comprehend the larger questions of justice within the public discourse. Uh, so this situation leads to what is called politics of despair, and this politics of despair, which is manifested in terms of rising inequality, the declining political trust, declining interpersonal relations, uh, also declining in civic knowledge, and finally is declining political efficacy. And the politics of despair can be described as a feeling of inefficacy and hopelessness, and the sense that nothing will ever change, uh, no matter what some imagined collective we, within quote, does try to bring change. So this politics of despair is gradually coming into our general imagination and the political, not private narratives and discussion. So in this desperate movement, it is exceedingly difficult to bring the basic structures, assumptions, constraints, and decision-making procedures that coalesce to produce political outcomes into public discussion. Because most part, these structures are not effectively public. So this generally frustrates people from the deprived and marginalized sections to look for an avenue to be part of public sphere, which should be participatory, which should be representative, which should be reflective. So this they do not get when this whole politics of despair sets in inside them. And what should be the antidote to this politics of despair? One, there are several, like there are several civic engagements, but the most effective antidote to this politics of despair is the social movements, and this is for the following reasons. First, democracy, especially the electoral democracy, has the tendency to become very oligarchic, and it leads to authoritarian politics that we can witness now, especially when it becomes a majoritarian in nature. And this provides the impetus to begin social movements. And these social movements allow us to enact citizenship. Unlike other participations, social movements allow us to author social change. And the change may not be immediate, but it helps us to change our ideas, change our minds, change our associations, change our public understanding, change the scope of political possibilities. And social movements also repoliticize the public life by reminding that people are the root of all legitimate democratic authority. So, movements are the performance of the political. They remind citizens that there is a public sphere where politics is enacted. In this sense, social movements are not only instrumental, but institutionally, it becomes part of an integrated democratic setup. And this teaches us how to reclaim citizenship when public life has become repressive, anemic, dispassionate to the public vote and demands. So it reminds us that political action is both necessary and beneficial. So, with this introductory remark, now I request Gopalji to present his paper. The timing, as Service says, it is for 20 to 25 minutes. And please, Professor Gopal Pradhan.
नमस्ते। सबसे पहली बात तो ये है कि अभी मैं आप लोगों के इस कोलकियम से पहले ही एक किताब पढ़ रहा था रोहित डे की पीपुल्स कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन, और उसमें उन्होंने कहा कि जो आजादी के समय की घटनाएं हैं, जो मेटा नैरेटिव है, पार्टीशन, इंडिपेंडेंस, इलेक्शंस, उन सब के बीच में कुछ छोटी छोटी चीजें खो जाती हैं। जैसे उन्होंने यहाँ से शुरू किया कि जलालाबाद नाम के एक छोटे से कस्बे के एक सब्जी विक्रेता ने एक सुप्रीम कोर्ट में याचिका दायर की, और कारण यह था कि उस कस्बे की नगर पालिका ने एक आदेश जारी किया था कि सब्जी बेचने का एक ही आदमी को लाइसेंस मिलेगा। तो उन्होंने यह जो याचिका दायर की सुप्रीम कोर्ट में, उसमें दो बातें शामिल थी। एक तो यही था कि आजीविका का मौलिक अधिकार है, मैं सब्जी लगाता था, मोहम्मद यासीन उनका नाम था, और वो आजीविका मेरी छीनी जाती है इस आदेश से। दूसरी बात यह जो महत्वपूर्ण बात है, और वह यह कि अगर एक ही आदमी को लाइसेंस मिलेगा तो इट विल लीड टू मोनोपोलाइजेशन ऑफ वेजिटेबल ट्रेड। तो कहने का मतलब ये है कि इससे हम लोगों को ये समझना होगा कि ये जो कंसंट्रेशन ऑफ पावर है इन पॉलिटिकल सेंस आल्सो, वो एक्चुअली जो डेमोक्रेसी है उसको जो वो सवाल उठाता है लोकतंत्र उस पर, तो वो सवाल इससे भी जुड़ा हुआ है कि मोनोपोलाइजेशन नहीं होना चाहिए, आर्थिक जगत की भी गतिविधियों का संकेंद्रण किन्हीं एक ही ताकतों के साथ नहीं होना चाहिए। जो अभी हम लोग बात कह रहे हैं कि डेमोक्रेसी एनीमिक हो गया है, तो उसके साथ इस समय का जो वातावरण चल रहा है मोनोपोलाइजेशन का, उसको जोड़ करके हम लोगों को देखना चाहिए। सबसे पहली बात तो ये मैं कहना चाहता हूँ कि डेमोक्रेसी का भी एक इकोनॉमिक कंटेंट होता है, और उस बात को हम लोगों को नहीं भूलना चाहिए, और कहने की आवश्यकता नहीं कि जैसे जैसे इजारेदारी बढ़ी है वैसे वैसे डेमोक्रेसी का भी क्षरण हुआ है। तो पहली बात तो यही है। दूसरी बात मैं ये कहना चाहता था कि देखिए, आजादी के आंदोलन के दौरान हमने डेमोक्रेसी को अर्जित किया, और यह जो आजादी के आंदोलन के दौरान हमने डेमोक्रेसी को अर्जित किया, तो ये बहुत मशहूर है कि गांधी जी जब भी कहीं पर जाते थे और अगर कोई माने फॉर्म हो भरने के लिए, उसमें पेशे का जब भी कॉलम होता था तो उसमें अपना पेशा वो किसानी लिखते थे। तो कहने का मतलब यह है कि जो आजादी का हमारा आंदोलन था, उस आंदोलन में जो डेमोक्रेसी की धारणा पैदा हुई थी, उस डेमोक्रेसी की धारणा को पैदा करने में हमारे देश के किसानों का बहुत बड़ा योगदान था। तो ये जो किसानों का बहुत बड़ा योगदान था, और आप जानते हैं कि हमारी आजादी के आंदोलन के दौरान पर्टिकुलरली 30s में जो किसानों के संगठन बने, तो उसकी ठोस अभिव्यक्ति हुई इस रूप में, और डेमोक्रेसी के केवल इलेक्टरल सेंस नहीं होता है कि पार्लियामेंट में 5 साल में हमने कुछ लोगों को चुन लिया, बल्कि डेमोक्रेसी बहुत सारे अन्य रूपों में भी अपने आप को अभिव्यक्त करती है, केवल और केवल वह इलेक्टोरल रूप में नहीं रहती है। तो जैसे उदाहरण हमने दिया, जिससे बात मैंने शुरू की, कि आपका एक सुप्रीम कोर्ट है, जिस सुप्रीम कोर्ट में कोई भी कॉमन आदमी सीधे जा सकता है और ये राइट है उसका। तो इस रूप में भी डेमोक्रेसी मौजूद है। दूसरी बात, जैसा हमने कहा, उसी जो केस रोहित डे ने जिसको कोट किया है, जहां से शुरू हुआ है, पीपुल्स इंटरवेंशन इन माने डेमोक्रेसी को साकार करने में लोगों का जिस तरह से हस्तक्षेप हुआ, तो उसकी शुरुआत के लिए उन्होंने वही कहा कि एक छोटा सा आदेश था एक नगर पालिका का कि अब यहाँ पर सब्जी बेचने का अधिकार केवल एक आदमी को लाइसेंस दिया जाएगा, जो मोनोपोलाइजेशन को लीड करेगा। तो कहने का मतलब यह है कि जो डेमोक्रेसी है, तो वो केवल फॉर्म नहीं है। अगर वह केवल इलेक्टोरल एरेना में रहता है, केवल पार्लियामेंट्री इलेक्शंस में रहता है, तो उसकी बुनियाद कमजोर हो जाएगी। जिस बात को अंबेडकर ने कहा था कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन को समर्पित करते हुए भी, कि ये टॉप ड्रेसिंग है, ऊपर से हमने इसको लागू कर दिया है, लेकिन जो सॉयल है वो सॉयल अनडेमोक्रेटिक है। तो इसलिए डेमोक्रेसी का सबसे पहली बात यही है कि वह ऊपर भी तभी तक सुरक्षित रहती है जब तक जो अदर इंस्टीट्यूशंस उसके हैं, जो उसकी पूरी फंक्शनिंग है, वो जब तक कायम रहती है, तभी तक ऊपर भी वह सुरक्षित रह सकता है। तो ये जो किसानों का हस्तक्षेप था, तो एक्चुअली क्या है कि वो एक बहुत बड़ी बात थी, और वह यह थी कि आप सब जानते हैं कि किसान को, और हम इस समय इस बात के लिए लड़ भी रहे हैं, और जो मोहम्मद यासीन की याचिका थी उस पर भी रोहित डे का यही कमेंट है कि वो पहली बार एक अधिकार संपन्न नागरिक के बतौर अपना एसर्शन है, दावेदारी है इस भारतीय गणतंत्र पर। तो अब ये जो किसान थे, तो उन्हें तो हमेशा से प्रजा माना गया था। राजा जैसा चाहेगा तो प्रजा वैसी करेगी, लेकिन उसके मुकाबले किसानों ने अपने आप को संगठित किया, उन्होंने अपने संगठन बनाए, और संगठन के बतौर उन्होंने बहुत सारी चीजों पर संघर्ष किया। और हम सब जानते हैं, इसको कई बार हम इसको इग्नोर कर सकते हैं, कि जमींदारी भी अपने आप में मोनोपोली का ही एक फॉर्म है। जो खेती का पूरा इलाका है, उसकी इजारेदारी कुछ लोगों के हाथ में, और इसलिए भारत के किसान आंदोलन का यह एक महत्वपूर्ण नारा रहा, जमींदारी का खात्मा। तो ये जो जमींदारी का खात्मा का नारा था, वह भी हमारे एक तरह से कहिए कि पूरे रूरल लाइफ का डेमोक्रेटाइजेशन का ही एक रूप था। और इस रूप में हमारी डेमोक्रेसी को एक कंटेंट देने का काम किया आजादी के आंदोलन के दौरान इन किसान आंदोलनों और किसान संगठनों में। तो ये जो किसान आंदोलन और किसान संगठन आए, पैदा हुए हमारे देश में उपनिवेशों के दौरान, उपनिवेशवाद के दौरान, औपनिवेशिक शासन के दौरान, ऐसा क्यों हुआ? इस पर सोचने के लिए कुछ एक चीजें मैं प्रस्तावित करता हूं, और वह यह कि हम सब जानते हैं कि ये जो अंग्रेज आए थे, इसके पहले ये लोग खुद ब्रिटेन में एक तरह का कारनामा किसानों के साथ कर चुके थे, और अब धीरे धीरे उसका दस्तावेजीकरण हो रहा है। इस बात को बहुत पहले से लोगों ने महसूस करना शुरू कर दिया था कि वहां पर जो खेती के सिलसिले में अंग्रेजों ने किया, अभी हाल में इयान अंगुस की किताब आई है, वार ऑन द कॉमन्स, उसमें उन्होंने बताया है कि कैसे एनक्लोजर्स का विकास हुआ है। और ये जो एनक्लोजर थे, तो उन्होंने किसानों को उनकी जमीनों से बेदखल किया, और उनको अपनी जमीनों से बेदखल किया, यहाँ तक कि भीख मांगने को अपराध घोषित कर दिया ताकि कारखानों में ये किसान काम कर सके। और दूसरा दौर उन्होंने कहा, पहले दौर में यह काम इंग्लैंड में किया गया और दूसरे दौर में उनका कहना है यान अंगुस का कि यह काम स्कॉटलैंड में किया गया। भयानक अकाल जिसमें पड़ा था तो स्कॉटलैंड में उस काम को किया गया। तो कहने का मतलब कि ये जो औपनिवेशिक हमारे शासक थे वो अपने यहाँ किसानी के साथ ऐसा कर चुके थे जो उन्होंने यहाँ आके भी करने का प्रयास किया। और इसलिए हमारे भारत के पूरी की पूरी इकोनॉमी में अपने तरह की जैसी भी वही इकोनॉमी थी उसमें पहला गंभीर हस्तक्षेप औपनिवेशिक काल में हुआ है। और वह गंभीर हस्तक्षेप इस तरह से हुआ, और फिर मैं कह रहा हूं कि इसमें कोई मोरल सवाल नहीं है बल्कि एक बाकायदे आर्थिक तर्क था जो इसको शासित कर रहा था। तर्क यह था कि खुद इंग्लैंड में बहुत सर्दी पड़ती थी और इसके कारण वहां खेती का मौसम समय बहुत छोटा हुआ करता था, लेकिन चूंकि ठंड ज्यादा पड़ती थी इसलिए उनको एनर्जी की भी ज्यादा जरूरत थी। तो स्वाभाविक तौर पर जो गर्म इलाके थे जहां पर अन्न की उपज ज्यादा होती थी वहां से उनको एनर्जी की जरूरत के लिए अपने संसाधनों की जरूरत थी। तो यह काम भी मेरे कहने का मतलब संसाधनों पर कब्जा करना, यह भी बहुत पहले यूरोप में शुरू हुआ था। और इस सिलसिले में मैं सिर्फ इस बात की याद दिलाना चाहता हूं कि मार्क्स ने जब अपने पत्रकारिता के जीवन की शुरुआत की थी राइनिशे जाइटुंग में, तो उन्होंने शुरू में ही जो लेख लिखे थे उसमें जो एक बहुत महत्वपूर्ण बात है वुड थेफ्ट का सवाल है, जिस पर जर्मनी की संसद विचार कर रही थी क्या कि जंगल से जो लकड़ी ले आते हैं स्थानीय लोग वो चोरी है, वुड थेफ्ट है ना। तो उस पर कानून बनाने की बात हुई थी और उस पर लगातार जो वहां पर संसद में बहसें चल रही थी उस पर मार्क्स ने न्यूराइनिशे जाइटुंग में लगातार लेख लिखे थे। उन लेखों का कलेक्शन करके डैनियल बेंसेड ने फ्रांसीसी में छपवाया था। तो बात क्या है कि एक तरह से संसाधनों पर कब्जे की यह लड़ाई है। तो इसलिए जब उपनिवेशवाद भारत में आता है तो यहाँ पर जो संसाधन थे उन संसाधनों पर कब्जा और एक आधिकारिक कब्जा, मोनोपोली है ना, ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी की पूरी मोनोपोली सारे संसाधनों पर है ना। तो ये शुरू हुआ और उसमें उन्होंने खेती में हस्तक्षेप किया क्योंकि उनके अपने जरूरतों के लिए यहाँ का अन्न ज्यादा जरूरी था और इसलिए उन्होंने खेती में हस्तक्षेप किया। अब यह जो खेती में उन्होंने हस्तक्षेप किया तो स्वाभाविक तौर पर फिर यहाँ पर अकाल वहां पर इंग्लैंड में स्कॉटलैंड वगैरह में पड़े थे, बहुत बुरे अकाल पड़े थे, तो वो अकाल अब हिंदुस्तान में भी शुरू होते हैं। और जब अकाल यहाँ पर शुरू होता है तो आप सब जानते हैं कि किसानों के बीच में फिर उसके कारण सामाजिक विक्षोभ पैदा हुए और इस बात पर डिटेल डिस्कशन किया गया है कि कैसे कैश क्रॉप्स, तो जो कैश क्रॉप्स आई हैं उन्होंने जो अन्न का रकबा था खेती का उसको कम कर दिया। और दूसरी बात यह है कि वो कैश क्रॉप्स पानी खूब खाती थी और इसलिए जमीनें बंजर होने लगी। तो ऐसी स्थिति में अकाल, अब यह जो अकाल है और यह जो हस्तक्षेप है 1942 के अकाल के बारे में बहुत सारी बातें पढ़ी गई हैं, बहुत सारा शोध भी उस पर हुआ है। तो क्या था कि फिर जो किसानों का विक्षोभ था तो उसे कंट्रोल करने के लिए तरह तरह के कानून, और ये इन कानूनों का फिर से मैं वही याद दिलाऊंगा कि मार्क्स ने जो नोट किया था कि वुड थेफ्ट के सवाल पर एक तो यही कि जो कॉमन्स है, कहने का मतलब जिस पर लोगों का अधिकार है, तो उसको प्राइवेटाइज कर लेना फिर उसके इस्तेमाल को अपराध घोषित कर देना, है ना। तो इस पूरी प्रक्रिया में राजनीति, अर्थतंत्र, लोकतंत्र और कानून ये सब के सब शामिल हो जाते हैं। उसी तरह का एक्सपेरिमेंट यहाँ पर भी किया गया हिंदुस्तान में। जब उपनिवेशवादी लोग आए, तो वो जब लोग आए तो उन्होंने यहाँ पर जो भारतीय खेती को नियंत्रित किया और उस पर माने स्थानीय जो लोग हैं, किसान, उनका अधिकार न रहे, बल्कि औपनिवेशिक शासक ही उसका अपनी तरह से उपयोग करें, इसके लिए तरह तरह के कानून बनाए गए जो दमनकारी कानून हैं। और हम सब जानते हैं उन दमनकारी कानूनों का इतिहास, और उनके खिलाफ लड़ाई लड़के ही स्वाधीनता आंदोलन का विकास हुआ। और इसलिए यह जो पीजेंट क्वेश्चन था, यह जो, और फिर जमींदारी के बारे में भी बात इसी बहाने कर रहा हूं कि जो किसान संगठनों का मुख्य नारा जो बना जमींदारी का विनाश, जमींदारी का उन्मूलन, उसका कारण क्या था? उसका कारण यही था कि अंग्रेजों ने जमींदारी नाम की संस्था का निर्माण किया। हम सब जानते हैं इस्तमारारी बंदोबस्त था जिसने इस जमींदारी नाम की संस्था का निर्माण किया, जिन्होंने फिर किसानों से लगान वसूल करके और फिर ब्रिटिश राज को जमा करना शुरू किया था। और उसकी एक लंबी कथा है, उसके बारे में विस्तार से लोगों ने बताया। यह काम करने के लिए एक तरह से भारत के बारे में देवनारायण द्विवेदी ने, जिस बात को मैंने एब्स्ट्रैक्ट में भी बताया है, शुरू में ही एक किताब लिखी है, 1928 की किताब है, जो प्रतिबंधित हो गई थी उस समय, हिंदी में ही लिखी गई थी। और एक्चुअली उसका जो शीर्षक है वो थोड़ा सा भ्रम पैदा करता है। उसका शीर्षक है देश की बात। तो देशर कथा जो थी गणेश सखाराम देउस्कर की, तो ऐसा लगता है कि ये उसका अनुवाद है, लेकिन ये उसका अनुवाद नहीं है, ये स्वतंत्र पुस्तक है। और उसमें उन्होंने इस बात को उठाया कि हमारा यह जो देश है, भारत देश है, तो इसका डी अर्बनाइजेशन हुआ है। और इस बात पर भी बहुत सारा शोध हो रहा है कि एक्चुअली ऐसा हुआ। जो भारत था तो उसमें एक तरह से जो शहर थे वो खत्म हुए न। ढाका खत्म हुआ तो उपनिवेशिक नगर कलकत्ता का विकास हुआ, ठीक है। सूरत बर्बाद हुआ तो औपनिवेशिक शहर बंबई का विकास हुआ। तो कहने का मतलब ये कि एक तरह से जो पुराना अर्बनाइजेशन था उसका डी अर्बनाइजेशन हुआ। तमाम जो शिल्पी थे वो देहातों में चले गए और इस प्रकार से जो भी हस्तशिल्प था यहाँ का वो सब खत्म हुआ। तब एक कृषि प्रधान देश के रूप में विकसित हुआ और उस कृषि में भी इन्होंने जो कहा कि जमींदारी की एक संस्था लाई जिसने एक तरह से खेती का पूरा मोनोपोलाइजेशन कर दिया। और उसके खिलाफ लड़ाई में किसान आंदोलन पैदा हुआ। उसने हमारे स्वाधीनता आंदोलन को एक डेमोक्रेटिक कंटेंट दिया है, एक डेमोक्रेसी का कंटेंट दिया। और सिर्फ इतना नहीं, उसने उस समय, और मैं लिटरेचर का स्टूडेंट हूं इसलिए इस बात को भी मुझे असर्ट करने दीजिए कि स्वाधीनता के खिलाफ लड़ाई के दौरान हमारा जो आधुनिक साहित्य लिखा गया जिसके सबसे बड़े सिरमौर प्रेमचंद हैं, तो अकारण नहीं है कि उनके यहाँ किसान समस्या केंद्र में है। और यह जो उनके यहाँ किसान समस्या केंद्र में है उस सिलसिले में बहुतेरे लोगों ने इस बात पर ध्यान दिया है कि वहां पर औपनिवेशिक शासन के खिलाफ लड़ाई और सामाजिक सुधार दोनों चीजें एक दूसरे के विरोध में नहीं बल्कि एक दूसरे के साथ जुड़ी हुई हैं। तो यह जो अंबेडकर ने चिन्हित किया था भारत के स्वाधीनता आंदोलन का अंतर्विरोध, वो एक तरह से प्रेमचंद में हमको दिखाई पड़ता है कि वो हल हुआ है। और वही विरासत थी जिस विरासत को लेकर के एक तरह से कह लीजिए कि भारत में जिसको आप प्रोग्रेसिव राइटर्स मूवमेंट कहते हैं, तो उस प्रोग्रेसिव राइटर्स मूवमेंट में भी जब हम जाएंगे, उनके लेखकों को हम पढ़ते हैं, तो वहां पर भी हम देखते हैं कि जैसे नागार्जुन, सबसे मशहूर जो पोएट हैं, उनकी एक किताब का नाम ही है, और यह भी एक मजेदार किस्म का तथ्य है कि वह किताब संस्कृत में है। उसका शीर्षक है कृषक शतकम, तो खेती, है ना। तो इन लोगों के यहाँ वही जो विरासत थी, वही जो लीगेसी थी, है ना, तो वो प्रतिफलित हुई है इनके यहाँ भी डेमोक्रेसी को परिभाषित करने में। और इसलिए हम सब जानते हैं कि ये जो प्रोग्रेसिव राइटर्स मूवमेंट है, इसमें भी एक स्ट्रांग डेमोक्रेटिक कंटेंट था, और बहुत मजबूत एक डेमोक्रेटिक कंटेंट था। तो कहने का मतलब ये है कि हमारा जो स्वाधीनता आंदोलन है, एक्चुअली उसने इस डेमोक्रेसी को एक कंटेंट दिया, जान दी, इसमें प्राण डाला। ये आइडिया है, लेकिन सिर्फ आइडिया के रूप में नहीं रहा। जैसा हमने कहा कि संविधान था, लेकिन उस संविधान को लोगों ने अपनी लड़ाइयों के जरिए पुनः पुनः आयत्त किया है। जैसे बंदी प्रत्यक्षीकरण, तो ये एक तरह से कहिए कि है, लेकिन फिर उसे अपनी लड़ाई के जरिए लोगों ने उसे साकार किया। तो उसी तरह से यह जो आजादी का आंदोलन था, उसमें ये जो किसान आंदोलन था, उसने जो लोकतंत्र की धारणा थी उसको एक ठोस आकार दिया है, और उसका प्रभाव बहुत बड़े पैमाने पर पड़ा। मैंने यहां से इसलिए इस बात को शुरू किया क्योंकि हम सब जानते हैं कि ये जो लिबरलाइजेशन कह रहे थे अभी मोहंती जी, तो नियो लिबरलिज्म जो आया, तो एक जमाने में रणधीर सिंह, प्रोफेसर मणि ठाकुर हैं, जानते ही होंगे, तो उन्होंने इस बात को कहा कि ये एक्चुअली रिकॉलोनाइजेशन है ना। उन्होंने कहा ग्लोबलाइजेशन के लिए कि हम पहली बार ग्लोबलाइज नहीं हो रहे हैं, हम अंग्रेजों के राज में भी ग्लोबलाइजेशन का ही शिकार हुए थे, क्योंकि एक विश्व अर्थव्यवस्था थी जिसके तहत भारत को इंटीग्रेट किया गया था। तो ये जो नया ग्लोबलाइजेशन है वह भी रिकॉलोनाइजेशन का प्रोजेक्ट है। तो एक तरह से कह लीजिए कि जो खेती में हस्तक्षेप हुआ था उस जमाने में, जो कॉलोनियल एक्सपेरिमेंट था उस समय में, तो उस पर थोड़े दिनों के लिए बंदिश इसलिए लगी क्योंकि उस आजादी की लड़ाई में इन किसानों ने अपना हस्तक्षेप किया और इन्होंने लोकतंत्र को अपनी तरह से परिभाषित किया। तो इसलिए उस प्रोजेक्ट पर थोड़े दिनों के लिए बंदिश लगी हुई थी। ये जो नियो लिबरलिज्म का दौर आया है, तो उसने इसीलिए
मोदी बोल रहे हैं इंडिया बनाम भारत वाले मुद्दे
और इस सिलसिले में एक बात पर और ध्यान दिया जाना चाहिए कि ये जो ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी है, इस पर भी बहुत सारा शोध हो रहा है। ये पहली कॉर्पोरेट कंपनी थी और इसमें इंग्लैंड के बड़े बड़े लोगों के शेयर थे, और इसलिए ये पूरे के पूरे इंग्लैंड की राजनीति को भी प्रभावित करती थी। तो एक तरह से कह लीजिए कि वह जो एक्सपेरिमेंट था ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी का, तो एक तरह से उसकी पुनरावृत्ति हो रही है। हम सब ने इसको देखा, जो नियो लिबरलिज्म शुरू हुआ तो बहुत सारी बातें आने लगी, हवा में तैरने लगी कि तब एक ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी आई थी, अभी तो 300 ईस्ट इंडिया कंपनी बन गई है। नमक पर कारगिल ने आकर के छापा मार लिया, और तब से नमक, हम जानते हैं नमक के लिए आंदोलन हुआ था, डांडी मार्च हुआ था, और नमक अब क्या स्थिति में पहुंच चुका है। पूरा का पूरा पानी, सबसे सुलभ चीज इस देश में, उसका मोनोपोलाइजेशन हुआ है, उसका व्यवसायीकरण हुआ है। तो एक तरह से कह लीजिए कि जो संसाधनों का पर एकाधिकार कर लेना का जो डिस्कोर्स था, तो उसकी कंटिन्यूटी पर थोड़े दिनों के लिए विराम लगा था, और उसका कारण वही था कि जो हमारा स्वाधीनता आंदोलन था उसमें कॉमन लोगों की हकदारी का सवाल प्रधानता में आ गया था, और नियो लिबरलिज्म के आने के साथ हमारा ये एंटी इंपीरियलिज्म भी कमजोर हुआ, और उसी के बरक्स हमारा डेमोक्रेटिक कंटेंट भी कमजोर हुआ, और इसका क्षरण होना शुरू हुआ है। और यह जो क्षरण होना शुरू हुआ है तो ठीक बात है कि जो किसान आंदोलन अभी हाल में हुआ तो उसने भी एक तरह से फिर से उसी ऊर्जा को जिया। कि कहने का मतलब ये कि कानून आप अपने मन से नहीं बना सकते हैं।
सर थोड़ा सा खत्म
जी
कर
जी, अब खत्म ही कर रहा हूं मैं कि कानून आप अपने मन से नहीं बना सकते हैं, लोगों का उस पर अधिकार होगा। और इस डिस्कोर्स के बारे में आप लोग जानते हैं कि बहुत पहले लोगों ने कहा कि सड़क पर कानून नहीं बनता है, तो एक्चुअली डेमोक्रेसी और कुछ नहीं, इसी की हकदारी है कि लोगों का ही अधिकार अंततः कानून बनाने पर होता है। पार्लियामेंट एक सिस्टम है मात्र, लेकिन अंतिम जो सॉवरेनिटी है इट इज इन्वेस्टेड इन द पीपुल ऑफ इंडिया। थैंक यू।
बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद आपको। आप एक हिस्टोरिकल पर्सपेक्टिव दिए, ऐतिहासिक एक दृष्टिकोण दिए जिसमें कि किसान गणतंत्र और लड़ाई किस तरीके से चाहते हैं और मोनोपोली को कैसे खत्म करते हैं, जो कि थोड़ा कंटेम्पररी में और थोड़ा ज़्यादा हो सकता है। आप आभास करेंगे इसके बारे में जब डिस्कशन होगा कि किस तरीके से जो कंटेम्पररी फार्मर्स मूवमेंट है उसका एक कंटिन्यूटी उसके ट्रेडिशनल फार्मर मूवमेंट के साथ है। आज थोड़ा आभास दिए, लेकिन जब क्वेश्चन आंसर सेशन में क्वेश्चंस आएंगे तो उसमें मैं सोच रहा हूँ आप उसको आगे थोड़ा बढ़ाएंगे। नेक्स्ट स्पीकर हमारे बजरंग जी, मैं आपको इनवाइट करता हूँ बोलने में, जिसमें कि जिनका टॉपिक है दलित स्त्री लेखन में अन्य। बजरंग जी।
बहुत शुक्रिया। इतने इनडेप्थ व्याख्यान के बाद में बहुत ही वैसा लगेगा सुपरफिशियल सा, सतही सा, लेकिन जिस बात की तरफ गोपाल जी ने इशारा किया, मैं मोहंती जी आपकी अनुमति से उसको थोड़ा सा मैंने उससे जोड़ते हुए, ये जो डेमोक्रेसी की आकांक्षा गहराई, उसी 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 गहरी होती आकांक्षा का परिणाम दलित स्त्रियों की आवाज के उभरने में देखा जा सकता है। जिस बात की तरफ डॉक्टर अम्बेडकर ने इशारा किया था, बार बार कहा था, इशारा क्या कि बार बार कहा था कि पॉलिटिकल डेमोक्रेसी एक व्यक्ति एक वोट, उसका एक वैल्यू, जिस तरह से प्रतिनिधियों को चुनना है, ये तब तक टिकाऊ नहीं है जब तक कि सामाजिक संबंधों में जनतंत्र न आए। सोशल डेमोक्रेसी के बगैर पॉलिटिकल डेमोक्रेसी टिकेगी नहीं। तो उस बात को तो समझा जब 1973 में साहित्य से जुड़े लोगों ने, जो एक्टिविस्ट भी थे और कवि भी थे 72-73 में ही, लेकिन जो बाबा साहब की बनाई हुई पार्टी रिपब्लिकन पार्टी ऑफ इंडिया, उससे गहरे में असंतुष्ट थे। 18 साल से 25 साल के युवा थे, महाराष्ट्र के युवा थे, दलित युवा एक्टिविस्ट राइटर, एक्टिविस्ट पोएट। तो उन्होंने जो जिस दलित पैंथर का निर्माण किया और जिसका दायरा उन्होंने बहुत बड़ा रखा और जिससे दलित साहित्य की मजबूत नींव पड़ी, तो उन्होंने तो इस बात को बहुत बहुत कहें कि बहुत तफसील में जाकर के उन प्रामाणिक विवरणों के साथ दर्ज किया कि सोशल डेमोक्रेसी का प्रारूप क्या होना चाहिए, कैसा है वो भी कहा, और क्या होना चाहिए वो आकांक्षा भी उसमें दर्ज की। एक चीज हम पाते हैं कि वो उस पैंथर के आंदोलन में किसी स्त्री की आवाज नहीं है, और इसकी तरफ ध्यान गया है। बाद के दिनों में जो महाराष्ट्र की दलित स्त्रियां आई, उन्होंने इसकी तरफ ध्यान दिया और ये कहा कि डॉक्टर अंबेडकर के आंदोलन में तो स्त्रियों की अच्छी संख्या है, चाहे वो महाड़ का सत्याग्रह हो, चाहे वो बम्बई के मिलों को लेकर के, मजदूरों को लेकर किया जाने वाला आंदोलन, सब जगह पर स्त्रियां दिखाई पड़ती हैं। पैंथर के यहाँ क्यों नहीं है? बेल हुक्स इसका जवाब देती हैं अपने ढंग से, वो वहाँ के संदर्भ में, ब्लैक फेमिनिज्म के संदर्भ में, कि ये जो कहें कि अतिशय आक्रामकता है, ये चीज स्त्रियों को उसमें शामिल होने से रोकती है। तो आक्रामकता थी, और जैसा कि जैसी भाषा मिली हुई थी, वो भाषा बहुत जेंडर्ड थी। आप नामदेव ढसाल को पढ़िए, बाकी लोगों को पढ़िए, जिस भाषा में बात करते हैं, मराठी बांझ हो गई है, इस तरह की भाषा जो उनकी है, तो वो चीज तो है कुछ नहीं। अभी इसकी ठीक से खोज बाकी है कि किन कारणों से दलित स्त्रियां जिन्होंने इतिहास बनाया, ऐसा मीनाक्षी मून और उर्मिला पवार ने कहा, तो वो बात के दिनों में दिखी क्यों नहीं। लेकिन वो सन 90 और 2000 के बीच में उनका उभार होता है, और वो उभार इस तर्क से हुआ, उसी डेमोक्रेसी के तर्क से हुआ कि सोशल डेमोक्रेसी तो ठीक है, लेकिन परिवार में डेमोक्रेसी के सवाल पर आपकी क्या पोजीशन है? परिवार में जनतंत्र होना चाहिए कि नहीं होना चाहिए? वैयक्तिक संबंधों में जनतंत्र होना चाहिए कि नहीं होना चाहिए? इंटरपर्सनल रिलेशंस में जनतंत्र होना चाहिए कि नहीं होना चाहिए? तो परिवार में जनतंत्र की बात आते ही थोड़ा डिस्कम्फर्ट, थोड़ी असहजता पैदा हुई, और ये कहा गया कि इस तरह ये अपने लिए अलग श्रेणी की मांग कर रही। उर्मिला पवार हो, चाहे ज्योति लांजेवार हो, चाहे हिंदी में भी बहुत सी दलित महिलाएं शुरू वाली जो पहली पीढ़ी की हैं, वो उन्होंने एक बात कही थी कि जो दलित व्यक्ति है साहित्य में, उसमें हमारे अनुभव दिखते नहीं हैं, हम उसमें कहीं नजर नहीं आते। ये चीज थोड़ी नागवार गुजरी थी, लेकिन जब ये मांग हुई कि हम ऐसे में, तो हम अपनी अलग श्रेणी के साथ अपना लेखन, अपना आंदोलन करना चाहती हैं, तो वो बहुत मुश्किल दौर रहा। 90 से 2000 के बीच का अगर आप देखें, 2010 तक का आप देखें, तो पाएंगे कि बहुत सिस्टमैटिक हमले हुए हैं, और इस आवाज को या तो धूमिल हो जाए, अनसुनी रह जाए, या चुप हो जाए। 4-5 तर्क दिए गए थे, उन तर्कों को दोहरा लेना जरूरी है। दलित स्त्रियां जैसा कि अस्मिताएं होती हैं, जो कहें कि अन्य से परिभाषित होती हैं, अन्य ही उन अस्मिताओं को परिभाषित करता है। तो अन्य कौन जो उनको दबा रहा है? तो ये इसके पहले जो अस्मिताएं उभरी हैं, उनके अन्य तो बहुत स्पष्ट हैं। दलितवाद का जो अन्य है, स्त्रीवाद का जो अन्य है, इनका तो बहुत स्पष्ट है। आदिवासियों का जो अन्य है, बहुत उसकी पहचान में कोई जटिलता नहीं है, कोई कॉम्प्लिकेशन नहीं है। लेकिन दलित स्त्रियों के मामले में तो ये स्थिति भिन्न है। और पुनः आपको कहें कि संदर्भ के लिए और दृष्टि के लिए, अगर आप ब्लैक फेमिनिज्म की तरफ जाते हैं, उन्होंने जो चीज डेवलप की इंटरसेक्शनलिटी वाली, से पहले के सत्रों में नहीं रह पाया, मुझे लगता है इस पे विमर्श हुआ है, तो वो उससे फिर ये बात खुलती है कि ये कोई सिंगल अन्य नहीं है, मल्टीपल है, जो अदर है मल्टीपल है। तो मैं जो बात कह रहा था कि जो दलित पुरुषों की तरफ से पहले बात आई कि दलित स्त्रियों का अलग से बोलना ये ठीक नहीं है, ये स्वीकार्य नहीं है, उसके लिए जो उनके तर्क हैं, उन तर्कों पर ध्यान देना, उन तर्कों को एक बार सुन लेना जरूरी है। उससे फिर बात जो है वो मैंने कहनी आसान हो जाएगी, जहां तक पहुंचना चाहता हूँ। एक तो उन्होंने कहा कि ये दलित स्त्री की अलग से आवाज मूल आंदोलन को कमजोर करेगी। डाइल्यूट हो जाएगा हमारा मूल इश्यू जो जाति का है, वो डाइल्यूशन के लिए ये हो जाएगा, ये काम करेगी, ये उसको ढीला करेगी उस आंदोलन की ताकत को। और दूसरा कहा कि ये जो दलित स्त्रियां अलग से बोल रही हैं, ये असल में जो हमारा अन्य है, जो सवर्ण समाज है, खासतौर से सवर्ण पुरुष है, उनके बहकावे में आ गई। हम तो उनके झांसे में नहीं आए, लेकिन उन्होंने हमारी स्त्रियों को पकड़ा, उनके बहकावे में आ गई। कई बड़ी मजबूत आवाजें आई दलित पुरुषों की, जिसमें ये बात आई कि ये अपने तो दिमाग से सोचती नहीं है, और ये जो उधर से निर्देश मिलता है उसके अनुसार चल रही हैं। ये बहुत डेट्रीमेंटल है, बहुत घातक आवाज है इस अर्थ में, इनकी आवाज नहीं है। आयदान जब आया उर्मिला पवार का और उनकी दूसरी राइटिंग आई, तो शरण कुमार लिम्बाले ने उस पर टिप्पणी की और उसमें एक बात कही, मैंने कि उर्मिला पवार के बहाने बाकी दलित स्त्रियों पर, कि ये तो हम अम्बेडकर वादियों के साथ नहीं हैं, ये नारीवादियों के संपर्क में पहुंच गई है। ये फेमिनिस्ट लोगों ने इनका थोड़ा चित्त बिगाड़ दिया है। ये उनके जो हिंदी में कहा जा रहा था कि, और वहां भी कहा जा रहा था, वो उन्होंने बदला कि नहीं, ये तो नारीवादियों का असर है, कुसंगति है, इसके चलते इस तरह से अपने पति को लेकर के जो उनका असम्मान का भाव है, जो परिवार को लेकर के उसके पुनर्रचना की मांग कर रही हैं, वो असल में नारीवादियों की संगति का दुष्प्रभाव है। तीसरी बात कही कि ये जो समस्या है पितृसत्ता की, ये बाद में सुलझा ली जाएगी, अभी इसको मुलतवी रखना ठीक रहेगा। फिर कहा कि ये जातिवाद की जो लड़ाई है, अभी इनको इसमें साथ देना चाहिए, और ये आनुषंगिक मामला है पुरुषवाद। कांचा इलैया ने एक बात कही, वो भी विचित्र रही है, कि जो दलित बहुजन पितृसत्ता है वो जनतांत्रिक है, और ब्राह्मण पितृसत्ता के से छुटकारा लेना है, जो हम जिसके लिए लड़ाई लड़ रहे हैं। लेकिन ये जो हमारी पितृसत्ता है, उसमें तो पूरा स्पेस है, बहुत जनतांत्रिक पितृसत्ता है। ये इस तरह के विचित्र तर्क आए। तो जो जहां से शुरू होता है कि जो एक अन्य स्थापित था, दलितवाद का अन्य, ये सवर्ण समाज है, सवर्ण पुरुष है, तो दलित स्त्री ने उसको तो बहुत कहे कि अनचाहे तोड़ दिया। अब एक दूसरा अन्य आ गया इसके सामने, दलित पुरुष ही अन्य हो गया। एक चीज ये आई, दलित स्त्रियों का लेखन पढ़े, विमर्श खास तौर से, जो क्रिएटिव राइटिंग हो उससे अलग, पाएंगे कि जो सवर्ण स्त्रियां हैं, जो मध्यवर्गीय स्त्रियां हैं, जो कहें कि शहरी और पावर होल्ड करने वाली स्त्रियां हैं, वो उनकी अन्य है, वो उनकी आवाज को सामने नहीं आने देना चाहती, उसको स्पेस नहीं देना चाहती। ये तीसरे अन्य की बात है। इस चीज को और थोड़ा कहें कि उसमें लेकर गई हमारे यहाँ हिंदी में जो रजनी तिलक थी, जो असल में जिनकी वजह से हिंदी में दलित स्त्रीवाद रूपाकार ले सका, शेप ले सका। तो रजनी तिलक ने तो ये भी कहा कि दलित स्त्रियों के भीतर से एक महत्वाकांक्षी दलित स्त्रियों का वर्ग उभर रहा है, जो इस आंदोलन का प्रतिपक्ष है, जो इस आंदोलन को कमजोर, एक अन्य भीतर भी है। अब वो मतलब इतने सारे अन्य हुए कि अब ये इसको अस्मितावाद के रूप में अगर आप देखते हैं कि ये कोई अस्मितावादी आंदोलन है दलित स्त्रियों का, तो इंसाफ नहीं हो पाएगा, न्याय नहीं हो पाएगा। क्योंकि इतने सारे अन्य जो जिस तरह से हम अस्मिताओं को समझने के आदी रहे हैं, अस्मिताओं के उभार को, अस्मिताओं के संघर्ष को, अस्मिताओं की स्थापना को, वो ये दलित स्त्रियों का जो स्वर है उसको तोड़ देता है। इसी बात को कहने के लिए ही मैंने ये प्रस्ताव दिया था। विवरण तो इसमें ज्यादा है, साहित्यिक कुछ उदाहरण भी देना हो तो वो पर्चे के रूप में जब दूंगा मोहंती साहब को तो उसमें पहुंच जाएगा। लेकिन मुख्य बात यही कहनी थी, खतरा जो अभी दिख रहा है, दो तीन चीजें ऐसी हैं जिस उम्मीद के साथ, जिस आश्वासन के साथ, जिस कहे कि उस मतलब की भरोसा दिलाते हुए ये आंदोलन उभरा था, 20 साल की यात्रा इसने पूरी की 2000 से लेकर 2020 तक। उसके बाद में कुछ ऐसी चीजें हुई हैं, दिख रही हैं, जिससे लगता है कि इसको अगर इसको रिजॉल्व नहीं किया गया तो ये जो उम्मीद बंध रही है कि शायद ही पूरी हो। एक तो यह है कि ये जो दलित स्त्रीवाद है, ये एक थियोरेटिकल वैचारिक रूप में बनता हुआ नहीं दिख रहा। जो है वो तो क्रिएटिव राइटिंग के रूप में है। क्रिएटिव राइटिंग की अपनी ताकत है, लेकिन उसकी अपनी सीमा है। एक तो यह है, ऐसी स्त्रियां, दलित स्त्रियां खासतौर से हिंदी में, अन्य जगहों पर भी हैं लेकिन बहुत कम हैं, जो इस मतलब इस मुद्दे पर फिलोसॉफिकली मतलब की आलोचना की भाषा में, सिद्धांत की भाषा में, विमर्श की भाषा में सोच रहे हैं। जो राजनीतिक पोजीशन है, जो राजनीतिक सुस्पष्टता है, क्लैरिटी है, वो भी थोड़ी दिक्कत में पड़ती नजर आती है। 2 साल पहले जब दलित स्त्रियों ने एक अभिनंदन समारोह किया रामदास अठावले का, तो लगा कि अगर राजनीतिक समझ इसी तरह की है तो फिर ये दिक्कत अलग है। इसमें कुछ मतलब जिसकी तरफ रजनी तिलक ने इशारा किया था कि ये मान लीजिए तुरंत कहीं कुछ पाने की जो महत्वाकांक्षा है उसकी परिणति क्या हो सकती है। एक चीज और है कि जिसमें दलितवाद और बाकी जितने भी अस्मिताओं के आंदोलन थे, उसमें जो होल टाइमर्स थे, उसमें जो कुलवक्ती कार्यकर्ता थे, हिंदी में तो मुझे इसका अभाव नजर आता है। दलित स्त्रियों का जो अगर आंदोलन इसको कहें, और कहना चाहिए, क्योंकि यहाँ आना जाना और कहें कि मिलना जुलना, इसी को आंदोलन कहते हैं बिल्कुल एलिमेंट्री तौर पर। तो यहाँ पर ऐसी कार्यकर्ता कहें कि रचनाकारों का, लेखिकाओं का, एक्टिविस्ट राइटर का दलित अस्मिता स्त्रियों के मध्य से उसकी बहुत कमी दिखती है। रजनी तिलक थी, लेकिन उनके जाने के बाद तो एक शून्य की स्थिति नजर आती है, उन्हें कोई उस तरह का दिखता नहीं है। संगठन का जो अभाव है वो तो अपनी जगह पर है। संगठन जो दलित स्त्रियों का होना चाहिए, जहां पर मिल बैठ करके चीजें समझी जाती हैं, तय की जाती हैं और शिनाख्त की जाती है, नेटवर्किंग की योजनाएं बनती हैं, स्ट्रेटजीज बनती हैं, उसका वो इंडिविजुअल्स नहीं कर सकते। ये मैं मतलब संकोच के साथ लेकिन साफ साफ कह रहा हूँ कि इंडिविजुअल्स नहीं कर सकते, कितने भी प्रभावशाली क्यों ना हो, संगठन चाहिए, और ऐसे संगठन नजर नहीं आते। फिलहाल इतनी बातें मुझे कहनी थी, मुझे मौका दिया, इसके लिए मैं क्रिएटिव थियरी का आप सबका बहुत आभारी हूँ। सविता जी का, मोहंती साहब का, और सभी सुमित साहब का, जिन्होंने, सर्वेश का, इन्होंने लगातार संपर्क में रहे और चीजें स्पष्ट करते रहे। मैं अपनी बात को यहीं पर रोकता हूँ। बहुत शुक्रिया। अभी मोहंती जी कहीं गए हैं, सविता जी आप संभाल लीजिए।
नहीं, मैं कहीं नहीं गया हूँ,
हाँ।
हूँ यहीं पे। सिर्फ मेरा चेहरा नहीं दिख रहा है, कुछ गड़बड़ है मेरा इसमें। ये खुल नहीं रहा है मेरा वीडियो। तो एनीवे, सो बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया बजरंग जी, आप एक नया डायमेंशन लाए सोशल मूवमेंट में। हम तो डेमोक्रेसी और सोशल मूवमेंट के बारे में बात करते हैं, लेकिन सोशल मूवमेंट का डेमोक्रेटाइजेशन कैसे होगा, उसके अंदर भी जो टेंशन है, जब सोशल मूवमेंट आगे बढ़ती है तो धीरे धीरे एक जो उसके अंदर जो टेंशन जागृत होती है, वो कौन से डायरेक्शन में जाएगा। ये जो डिबेट नक्सलाइट मूवमेंट भी देखने को मिला था, क्योंकि जब नक्सलाइट मूवमेंट चल रहा था उसके अंदर भी ये डिबेट आया कि महिलाओं का रोल क्या होगा उसमें, और किस तरीके से पितृसत्तात्मक जो मूवमेंट है, जो कि डेमोक्रेटाइज करना चाहते हैं सोसाइटी को, उसमें महिलाओं के बारे में क्या होगा। इससे मेरा एक बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग बात याद आती है। हमारे कॉलेज में एक दलित अंबेडकर के ऊपर एक टॉक था, जिसमें कि एक व्यक्ति ने नाम नहीं लूंगा, बजरंग जी जानते हैं उनको, नाम नहीं लूंगा, तो वो आए थे। तो उन्होंने बोले कि ठीक है, महिलाओं का तो, दलित महिलाओं का तो ठीक है, हो रहा है, पढ़ाई लिखाई करके वो आगे बढ़ रहे हैं, लेकिन वो पढ़ाई लिखाई करने के बाद जो दलित पुरुष हैं उनके साथ शादी करने के लिए तैयार नहीं होते हैं। तो मतलब किस तरीके से कंट्रोल भी किया जाए और किस तरीके से उनको दबाने का कोशिश किया जाए, ये सारे चीज भी जब आता है तो मूवमेंट में भी यही देखने को मिलता है। बट एनीवे, ये एक बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग ये आया कि उसको किस तरीके से मूवमेंट को डेमोक्रेटाइज करेंगे और उसमें कैसे हमारा आंदोलन खत्म हो जाएगा या टूट जाएगा, ये सब खतरा है। उसको थोड़ा सा आगे थोड़ा सा विस्तृत रूप में बजरंग जी बताएंगे, कोई कॉन्क्रीट एविडेंस देके। नेक्स्ट जो स्पीकर है, आई इनवाइट डॉक्टर माया टू प्रेजेंट पेपर टाइटल्ड just a minute. Maya, yes, could you just read out your paper title?
Sure. First of all, I thank Dr. Biswajit Mohanty for organizing a panel on this theme, very important theme. My paper is titled Concrete Conditions, Abstract Rights Towards New Demands of the Domestic Workers Movement. Now, given the theme of today's panel, the way in which I'm placing my work and my views before you, it's within this framework that the thrust of 200 years of social movements has been importantly to bring out what is seen as the private into the public, and in that ways the resistance, the contestation works towards a major transformation. So within this framework, I am sharing my experience and the details of a very important demand that has emerged from the domestic workers movement. And this is a demand that is being debated, discussed internationally within, feminist collectives, within trade union circles, within progressive movements across, Europe, Latin America, and even in South Asia and Africa. So I'm bringing some of those insights here and sharing them with you. Post the much celebrated ILO deliberations that culminated in the Domestic Workers Convention 2011, that is also known as Convention 189, the persisting feminization of paid domestic work and its undervaluation in terms of unpaid overtime, low stagnant wages, etc., have increasingly drawn attention to the deep-seated problems with the existing paradigm of envisaging rights for domestic workers. Indeed, demands emerging from campaigns from the movement that draw on the logic of the ILO's Domestic Workers Convention number 189 warrant closer scrutiny, given the present form of the state capital combine, industrial relations machinery, and the fleeting organizational capacity of domestic workers. Given this and the burgeoning number of domestic workers, there is need for critical rethinking of the interventions traditionally sought in the domain of paid domestic work. Now, ILO Convention 189 speaks of minimum standards of work, known as decent work, effective complaint mechanisms, and compliance with legislation, labor inspection, etc. However, such rights of domestic workers have been paradoxically envisaged in the context of steady withdrawal of the state from the regulation of employer-employee work relations, including those of the formal sector. Notably, it is the individual human rights discourse as championed by human rights and development institutions party to the ILO proceedings, which characterizes significant components of the Convention 189 and also which influences several quarters of the domestic workers' movement. Criticism of human rights paradigm are closely related to assessments of radical philosophers like Karl Marx, who argued that liberal notions of indivisible individual rights and ideas of justice are rights of separation, which assert freedom from interference. In other words, such a paradigm of abstract rights projects that within political society, people are cooperative, although in their economic roles, they are competitive, individualistic, and egoistic. A recent assessment or critique of such kind is found in the writings of a contemporary critical theorist, many of us know him, Slavoj Žižek, who argues that, and I'm quoting him, universal human rights are effectively the right of white male property owners to exchange freely on the market, exploit workers and women, and exert political domination. Quote closed. There is then a fundamental problem with the individual centric human rights paradigm, for it assumes that formal work contracts between the individual employers and domestic workers are in themselves self regulatory, that is, inherently capable of ensuring minimum standards of work and an end to overexploitation. In contemporary times, the human rights discussion is largely dominated by two theories. The interest theory argues that the principal function of human rights is to protect and promote certain essential human interests. Then we have the will theory, which asserts that the validity of human rights is based on the unique human capacity for freedom. Now, whichever the theory, the concept of human rights is open to criticism. A major concern stems from the tendency of such an abstract principle of rights with respect to a common minimum to overlook the specificities of region, form of social relations, context, etc. In other words, the tendency of generalized human rights to be abstracted from concrete conditions like exploitative labor relations stemming from the dominance of employers and the nexus between state and capital, as well as myriad other concrete inequalities in society, is what I argue an undeniable problem. So let me, delve on the concrete conditions, therefore, that inform paid domestic work. Domestic workers, continue to exist in the margins of both the world labor market and the domestic labor market, as their labor is markedly invisibilized and undervalued. Unlike other relations of work where the workplace are comparatively easier to identify due to their public presence, the domestic workers' workplace is atypical, considering it is the private home of someone else. Entering this atypical workplace, which appears just like a black hole from which no information comes out, a large volume of domestic workers are actually lost to enumerators. And that is why we have so much conflicting data on this workforce. The history of state regulation of labor relations amply reveals the exclusion of domestic work relations and the resulting reinforcement of the privatized and informal nature of an otherwise very concrete form of labor extraction. Now, in earlier times, of course, all work relations were seen as private domestic relations. However, the combining of large number of workers at crucial points of the capitalist value creation chain and labor's visible collective mobilization against exploitative work arrangements in new workplaces like factories, plantations, mines, etc., propelled the steady recognition of employer-employee relations, not as private domestic relations, but as constituting the public domain of social relations. Now, this transition in India gradually unfolded during the late colonial period onwards. Now, in contrast to these changing circumstances of workers in legally defined workplaces, scores of informal workers, which includes domestic workers, have continued to labor under some form of contractual obligations, usually verbal, that are heavily weighted against them. The predominantly personalized, familial nature of the domestic workers' workplace has been used as an ideological justification for non-regulation by public authority, that is the state, in many parts of the world. And this has persisted in spite of trends of municipalization of certain kinds of work like scavenging, the municipalization of street cleaning, waste management, waterworks, etc., in the 19th and 20th centuries. In other words, let's say the paid work relation is considered a private matter between two parties when it comes to domestic workers, and this sidelines the concrete civic principles of contract informing this work relation and allows the state to deny legal subjecthood to domestic workers, as is evident in, again, many parts of the world. The result is numerous ambiguities in prevalent in the legislative entitlements governing the paid domestic work sector, as well as poor implementation of otherwise concrete laws that seek to enhance the rights of domestic workers. Hence, despite recent legislative action and policy interventions, especially those that have come after Convention 189 of the ILO, the privatized nature of this work and its regulation are pervasive. To elaborate, domestic workers perform their services in isolation, since their workplace, that is the employer's home, requires them to enter the work process in a highly individualized form. The performance of domestic work in a highly isolated, individuated manner in the private familial domain where the state regulation is markedly absent has consequently rarely allowed for standardization of wages and conditions of work or for effective unionization of domestic workers. Further, the employer's writ runs large, and in their private domains, they assert what I call quasi-judicial power over workers, in that they exercise the authority to both accuse and adjudicate on claims like theft, non-payment of wages, acts of workers' quote-unquote insubordination, etc. A practice which, of course, leaves workers in a very vulnerable condition. This vulnerability is exceptionally high in the case of full-time live-in workers, whose entire being and access to the public arena is determined by the employer. Indeed, in the domestic services industry in many parts of the world, domestic workers are typically pitched against a multitude of individual employers, each possessing such quasi-judicial powers that manifest themselves in unique technologies of control. The private power of employers, especially in gated residential complexes, the way we see them in Noida, in Gurgaon, for example, are embodied not only in the stagnant wages, but also in quote-unquote interrogation rooms, separate service elevators, illegal confinement, rampant physical and verbal violence, and the practice of quote-unquote no entry, by which one employer can debar a domestic worker from entering a residential complex so as to prevent her from working for other employers. Of course, in real terms, the workplace of domestic workers is hardly a private space for them, just because they are working in the home or domestic sphere of their employer. For this dimension to inform policy discourse and lawmaking in concrete and sustainable ways that protect the domestic worker, as well as satisfy consuming households, the umbilical cord connecting the domestic worker to this paid work through a private employer needs to be severed. It needs to be cut. Simply put, the work process in itself needs an overhauling by transforming who the principal employer is in this work relation. The need for this transformation of work relations itself is evident because as long as the individual employer or the private housekeeping agency is the wage provider, the unilateral power and dominance of the employer in contract will continue to dictate the working conditions and wage levels. Even when placement agencies or housekeeping companies are regulated, the state refrains from active regulation of the actual work relationship between the employer-employee, Until domestic workers, therefore, are not made workers of the city government, town councils, or the municipalities, state regulation of working conditions in this sector shall remain episodic and paternalistic. What I mean is, public scrutiny or state intervention would continue to materialize only when the public authority deems fit. The highly individuated employer-employee relationships and intense private regulation of the paid domestic work relation sync actually very, very comfortably with the current conjuncture in which regulation of the work relation is being consistently reduced to a private matter between employers and workers. This is a paradigm of deregulation. Many of us are familiar with it, and it marks a visible jurisprudential shift in the labor law regime, which is characterized typically by the dilution of the powers of the labor inspectorate, exemptions of more and more workplaces and work relations from compliance with labor laws, etc. This dimension, therefore, of retreating state regulation has to be factored into proposed solutions that are being debated within the movement so as to address the problems of the paid domestic work industry. I'd just like to draw some attention to the blind spots in contemporary laws. Drawing on the logic of the ILO Convention 189, which was encoded in human rights, in the human rights paradigm, many quarters of the domestic workers' movement have been preoccupied with endeavors to seek legal reforms that essentially amount to extending the existing corpus of labor laws, which, mind you, are actually suited for factory-like workplaces, to the atypical personalized employer-employee relations in the domestic work industry. Without transforming the employer-employee relationship in paid domestic work, such initiatives ultimately translate into abstract rights. To a significant extent, then, the peculiarities of this work relation, paid domestic work relation, explain the persisting problems of limited legal coverage as well as implementation gaps in specific laws that have been envisaged for this workforce. Using some illustrative case studies of legal and policy developments, let me draw your attention to the blind spots informing legal initiatives and policy discourses so far, 10, 12 years after ILO Convention 189. Now, many countries at present have not even ratified ILO Convention 189. These include countries where paid domestic work constitutes a large sector of employment. Some of these countries have sought to show that while their governments have not ratified Convention 189, there have been efforts nonetheless to include domestic workers within the ambit of national legislation. However, proactive state intervention, we know, depends significantly on enhancing the Labor Department's resources, its outreach, its powers, and on extensive data collection on such informal labor. Given that a large component of domestic workers in cities are increasingly migrants. Of course, such involvement mandates greater state expenditure, which looks unlikely in current times. In fact, in the present conjuncture, widespread austerity measures in the so-called, quote-unquote, global north, as well as in the backdrop of a much longer history of inadequate state investment in the social sector in the quote-unquote global south, we have seen steady decline in the allocation of state funding for labor inspection, data collection on labor, for labor welfare schemes, etc. Now, this amounts to a vicious cycle, as limited documentation on a workforce like domestic workers ultimately affects policy decisions and the general accessibility to whatever piecemeal welfare schemes exist for such workers. There are countries, even as of today, that do not identify domestic workers as workers, and consequently, these workers do not figure in several key labor laws on trade unions, on disputes redressal, on unfair dismissal, payment of wages, maternity benefits, etc. Now, even if some laws are amended or tweaked by governments, not all the important legislations are amended. And so the overall labor law regime and policy discourses in several countries are ridden with inconsistencies, which hardly then benefit domestic workers. To elaborate a marked contradiction in the unfolding legal and policy discourses, it is pretty evident when we look at the question of recognizing the necessity of fixed working hours on the one hand, and the simultaneous legitimacy prescribed to full time live in domestic work agreements on the other hand. So, this is an anomaly stemming from the concessions granted to employer lobbies during the formulation of the ILO Convention 189. Since the residence of a live in domestic worker is that of his or her employer, and this constitutes a private domain, regulation of the hours of work become extremely difficult, if not impossible, creating a situation akin to slavery. When the very identity of a worker is built on quantifiable labor time, the continued recognition of full-time live-in domestic quote-unquote help keeps such workers tied down to informality, since such work agreements will remain nearly impossible to regulate and the work performed under them extremely difficult to quantify. Further, the growing call for separate legislation for domestic workers has also proven to be a dead end. In the case of South Asian countries where some such form of legislative action has been cautiously introduced, governments restrict themselves typically to the question of skilling and social security, but leave untouched the required amendments to several key labor laws that expressly shape the fundamentals of the work agreement, the nature of the work, as well as ensure the right to unionize and guarantee active regulation of the work contracts by the state. So, separate welfare legislations introduced by some countries we find are also limited in terms of what they explicitly legitimize. In the case of Bangladesh, we find that its domestic worker protection and welfare policy 2015 allows for employment of children as young as 12 years for paid domestic work. The problems with separate legislation for domestic workers is further evident, for example, in the negligible relief gained by majority of domestic workers under Indian legislation, like the Unorganized Workers Social Security Act 2008 and the Domestic Workers Welfare Board Act. More than poor implementation of such legislation, the problem actually lies in its foundational logic. These laws strategically limit state intervention to an extension of social security and not to active regulation of the employer employee relation. Denied of legal subjecthood as workers due to numerous inconsistencies within labor laws, domestic workers then gain little by being made legal recipients of state welfare. Of course, in the context of fleeting and sporadic organization of domestic workers and the regular undercutting of collective bargaining by the continuous entry of new migrant workers into this work, existing welfare legislation for this workforce dangerously positions the onus of enforcement largely with the state. But what if the state is passive? What if the state is inactive and reactionary? And what if the labor force is unorganized and disadvantaged in asserting claims for benefits? Hence, welfarist measures in themselves are hardly reassuring, for these measures tendentially reduce labor to a beneficiary rather than a rights holder. In fact, this format of welfarist measures syncs well with the growing deregulation paradigm, wherein governments can easily show a plethora of legislation on paper, usually welfare legislation, that are actually in real terms poorly implemented. Moving towards a conclusion, in terms of laws and policies that need to change, we clearly need to envision expansive intervention so as to cover all the different stages in the process of paid domestic work, from recruitment to allocation of work to the payment of wages to the renegotiation of the contract, etc. Most important are the concrete state interventions that facilitate the complete transformation of the work process itself by situating the state as the employer in contract. An intervention at this level and of this extent reduces the arduous negotiations that an individual domestic worker often has to make with multiple employers, and that too, remember, in a private space that employers themselves dominate. Instead of workers being pitched against the enormous private power of an employer, or for that matter, being pitched against a multitude of private employers, a more concerted struggle for standardized labor norms can unfold with housework becoming a public or a municipal work regulated by the state. By situating the state as the employer in contract, municipalization as an expansive form of intervention facilitates the complete transformation of the work process itself, which is all the more important considering that the stigmatized nature of this work and its location, its concentration in the lowest rungs of the labor market keeps reproducing casteism, racism, etc. Hence, municipalization needs to become a global need, a demand which can metamorphose into concrete campaigns and strategic mobilization to actualize it. Notably, in several parts of the world, there are precedents of municipalization of stigmatized labor related to waste management, as well as public utilities or services of general economic interest, such as water supply, sewage, public transport, childcare, elder care, care for the disabled, etc. It is in these forms of municipal control and management of certain public utilities, especially through municipal companies and through municipal employees, that are noteworthy, that are an important precedent. This trend, of course, was steadily curtailed in the 1970s and early 1980s as a neoliberal policy beliefs gained ground. However, we are seeing the trend of re-municipalization unfold in many parts of the world. The comeback has unfolded in various ways. I can go into it during the Q&A session. Now, municipalization of domestic work, that is, domestic workers becoming employees of the municipality or the city government, hence entails paid domestic work transitioning into a public work, leading to a much needed transformation in the employer-employee relationship of a burgeoning, growing industry. Having a public authority to hold accountable for their work conditions, domestic workers stand to benefit hugely as they would begin to emerge out of their highly vulnerable condition in the private domains of existing employers, as well as from the onerous task of negotiating with a multitude of employers. It is essentially through bodies of the municipal authority, that would mean public employment exchange offices, wage boards, etc., that domestic workers will find greater space to organize themselves and channelize their collective efforts, without which implementation of protective or welfarist legislation is a distant dream. Furthermore, economically vulnerable households that are struggling to take care of their sick and infirm family members and or have pregnant female members who need housework assistance would de facto become one of the biggest beneficiaries of such municipalization that strives to make many more personal services a public good. With respect to the growing deregulatory industrial relations paradigm and the intrinsically privatized nature of domestic work in its present form, existing ILO-led discourses prove highly inadequate. At present, there is dire need for an approach that takes us well beyond the piecemeal welfarist and other labor legislation amendments that stop short of actually changing the format of highly individuated employer-employee relations in paid domestic work. That can be done by firmly imbricating the state within this domain of work. Municipalization of domestic work is one of the crucial ways of locating the state firmly within this domain of social reproduction, but it also tendentially represents an enhancement of women's claims on the state. While upper classes of women, by subletting the drudgery of housework onto a domestic worker, have continued to escape several repercussions of patriarchal domesticity, a vast majority of women from the working class and laboring poor are trapped in the drudgery of backbreaking, routinized housework that eats into their leisure time and access to regular waged employment. The latter are consequently living half lives as non-persons and as...
Maya, could you finish?
Yeah, I'm just wrapping up. As maids within their own families. It is this majority section of women who await liberation from lonely, mundane housework that the new programmatic solutions, such as municipalization, is something that the domestic workers movement strives to account for. I conclude with saying that until society is in a condition to facilitate higher forms of socialization of social reproduction and thereby bring domestic work out of the isolated private realm to the realm of the public socialized work, an interim measure is to push towards municipalization. We have much ground to gain with such a demand, given the trends of remunicipalization of public utilities and services in recent years in many parts of the world. Even more significantly, municipalization of domestic work catapults the question of work's formalization from merely an issue of domestic workers to a larger community issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Well, this is very interesting and insightful theorization of domestic workers. But one thing is that what are the, because you are working with them, and what are the difficulties that you find to organize them, and how do you think that their organization would impact the policy issues? Of course, the state is there, but gradually that has to come from the organized protest or organized front. So, what are the challenges that you face while organizing these workers that needs to be answered? Our next speaker is Vaibhav, and I request Vaibhav to spell out his title and present the paper.
Yeah. Um, Thank you, Professor Viswajit, for the invite, and Surveys for all the hard work that you have put in. First of all, a note of apology. I could not switch on my camera because I have very shaky internet. I'm traveling. So what I can do is for all of you is maybe like provide a speaker context so that all of you can relate from where my work actually stems from. A large part of my life I spent growing up in Odisha as a gender non-conforming person, and that's why one thing which very personally stuck to me was this idea of access to information about oneself. And this is something which has been a guiding principle throughout my academic journey, which, in comparison to a lot of people here, is not quite long. But I'll try my best to fit this entire presentation within this rubric of democratizing knowledge for everyone here, so that we can imagine solidarities when we talk about rights and democracy. On that note, today's talk addresses certain fundamental and structural impediments that the QIA community faces in India. By LGBTQIA plus, I mean lesbians, gays, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and the plus designates all the identities which could not be fit into the acronym, but they still exist, and they deserve due credit in our references. These are critical like my talk delves into certain critical reflections drawn from my fieldwork in various parts of India and partly from my own life. I would refrain from like calling it autoethnography, but the life cannot be decentered from this study. At the very outset, I would like to provide a structure for this discussion for the benefit of the audience and for me to understand the paucity of time, because one thing which the queer community fails to process in life is the idea of progressive time, or what in academia we eloquently pass off as temporality. I would humbly start by situating this conversation in a history not written by us and a life not lived by us on our own terms, followed by critically unpacking the complex nature of freedom in the Indian democracy. I would walk through various epistemic tensions in our disciplinary traditions to highlight how articulation of freedom for diverse gender and sexual minorities remains incomplete in the present time. And finally, I would like to conclude this address by talking about certain possibilities of rights, representations, and redistribution for, for our community in India. I would begin by touching upon something the chair of the current panel talked about. Professor Biswajit started today's conversation with a line that today's conversation is from the grassroots. What do we mean by grassroots? Why do we invoke the grassroots before theorizing complex political realities in our work? As academicians, we often write it as a confession letter on how traditional academia embodies a history of robbing stories, polishing them to further their understanding of realities. However, the storytelling power that we often hold is laced with epistemic injustices which decenters reality from the margins. Therefore, much of this paper deals with reimagining what we have consumed uncritically, or to address a concern which a dear friend and a prominent trans rights activist in India once said, Grace Banu. They want our stories, but not us. I have titled today's paper Searching for Freedom, LGBTQ plus rights in Indian democracy. Before anyone takes offense at the title or files an FIR against me, let me state that the title highlights how the LGBTQ plus community has been living in an extra legal space bereft of rights in our country, where we have been asked to imagine our lives in secrecy, marry ourselves into a compromise, and rescue ourselves from a gradual extinction. I think what remains fundamental to any conversation concerning democracy is the relationship between the individual and the society. The much celebrated ethos of our democratic structure derives heavily from its promise of according freedom and equality to its constituents. Therefore, I pose the first question for a critical examination, that how free is our freedom? Freedom has been fundamentally been conditional in nature in India. It is operationalized through law, collective history, and the politics around it. Thus, it becomes important for me to treat law and information to highlight the dialectical nature between the gender non-conforming individuals and the society in India. The history of the LGBTQ community in India is a history of criminalization. We do not have a history of the ordinary or the everyday for us. What a lot of revisionist historians have tried to do in India is trace the life of trans queer people in various dynasties. However, I treat those references or cases as exceptions and not as the ordinary. To talk about a community's criminality, one would find an interesting collaboration between writing history and writing law to see how a social deviance was institutionalized as a state project to eradicate gender non-conforming persons as sites of social disorder. One such example is the Criminal Tribes Act 1871. The chapter 2 of this act deals with transgender persons as eunuchs and penalizes their gender performance and expression by providing the state excessive power to incarcerate them, take away their properties, and not let them hold the right to kinship or human continuity. This is something historians like Jessica Hinchy call a gradual project of extinction. But the existence of such a law also begs an important question here. How did such a discriminatory law exist or survive critical inquiry when India was articulating a break from colonial logic and rule? Part of this answer lies in our collective history. How we have written Indian history has largely reiterated the stereotypes that the community is traditionally viewed through. When I usually read academic work on transgender communities in India, it sings the same song in different ways, that they are a mobile community. Their traditional work type was badhai and other ritualistic practices. However, if one examines the earliest archival records in the northern western province of India, we realize that the most common occupation for the transgender community in India was agriculture, and they had stable households, however humble. What I want to highlight by this example of digression is to highlight the injustice, that injustice becomes a collaborative project of writing history and law to mainstream and normalize state excesses like a gradual project of extension named Criminal Tribes Act. Therefore, when we try to articulate our freedom and rights in present time, we do it with the burden of historical erasures and criminalization. This brings me to the contemporary politics of LGBTQ plus rights and representation. The Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act 2019, enacted by the Parliament, set in motion a formative phase for imagining a transgender citizenship in India, where policymakers arrogated themselves the power to ascertain what recognition, representation, and rights should look like for a historically marginalized community comprising of hijras, kinnars, transgender persons, and gender non-conforming persons at large. There are two major problems to this predicament that I view in the present time. One, the political reluctance to constitutionally administer, and second, the fissures in our public infrastructure to deliver. This is something I label as politics of bare minimum, where the state agreeing to provide a bare life to gender non-conforming persons is narrated as a watershed moment for human rights, whereas the community is forced to undergo a state of platitude, which I label as, or which other scholars have also labeled as, benevolent subordination, to be grateful for receiving the bare minimum from the state. This reluctance to mainstream the rights and welfare of LGBTQ persons is not just ingrained in the political ideology of the present government. Fundamentally, it can be located in how technocratic modes of governance organize the population into a workable democracy. Simply put, you matter only if you exist as data or information. The purpose of data in contemporary India has critically shifted from subjectively knowing to erasing objectively. Rather than becoming a tool to empower, data has become a weapon to invisibilize humans whose needs and social locations cast doubt on the efficacy of our democracy and knowledge infrastructure. In a scientific culture of human development, a problem cannot be addressed if decision makers cannot deduce the economics and statistics of a collective good. The gender binary of man and woman provides an easy base for the state to discharge its duties based on simple correlations and proportionalities. If we dig deeper, we will find how the hegemonic social realities of India leave a strong imprint on objective data to manufacture realities. Large-scale audit exercises are operationalized based on certain social assumptions, like the population is a static community, the population has a household, the population has a heterosexual marriage, a population can participate in procreative activities. What this template of audit does is it very systematically leaves out a lot of constituents which generally do not subscribe to these normative factors to be counted in. And when you are not accounted for within a state project, the idea or conversation of democratic rights or your representation in policies becomes a secondary conversation altogether. This entire predicament brings me to a fundamental conversation which I would like to pose here, which is how the human body is diagnosed. Like, how do we, what is the historical diagnosis of the human body, and how there exists a strong political economy around our gendered bodies. The colonial state and its technologies, through a synergic collaboration of law, medicine, and policing, constructed hijras and transgender persons as a site of extra legal and morally deprived bodies whose lives, labors, and love were systematically invisibilized and visibilized to render them unworthy of any social respect or state protection. From a productivist perspective, criminalized was sanctioned on indigenous bodies uh, from which preferred labor could not be extracted in India. And therefore, the political economy of criminality demanded an imperative disciplinary elimination of transgender persons to further the colonial project of Western development, uh, Western morality, and social order. It is very important to understand how this political economy actively collaborated with law to create a marginalization that seeped into the everyday of our social interaction. Trans queer persons embody a dysphoria or a possibility that counters diffused human docility in any disciplinary regime, what we like also call as the policing state or the bureaucratic state. Therefore, gender does not just remain a category or an anatomical arrangement of organs or its performance, but the epistemic ground to imagine what form of state is imagined by creating the image of the other, which also becomes the reference point for all of us to understand what the state is trying to tell us when it says what not to be or what the state will not care about. Freedom, therefore, here becomes a cautionary tale of why not to transgress the social normative standards or compartments which were uh, given to us systematically or unsystematically in our social interactions and through state projects. Therefore, the project of political and social conformity stemmed from this state of exception where transgression was dealt with criminalization, and criminalization invited a set of uh, like a set or a series of instances where rights, representations, and redistributions were taken away from marginalized persons, even within a welfare society. Therefore, since 1990s, transgender persons and gender non-conforming persons in India have been in a never-ending loop of seeking rights and recognition through judicial corrections rendered by various state high courts and the Supreme Court of India. The flooded corridors of the judiciary by gender non-conforming petitioners do not indicate the benevolence of the justice system of India, but rather narrate the structural failure of all the three branches of the Indian state, legislature, judiciary, and executive, in treating transgender persons as a lesser political actor and a second class citizen in a plural democracy like in India. Therefore, the conversation the conversation today here actually highlights how we witness human rights in the present time, how human rights are no longer fundamental entitlements that people are born with, but state consensus like concessions demanded in houses of appeal because the status quo does not consider LGBTQ persons as equal holder of rights, representations, and various form of redistributions in the present state. To conclude, I would like to highlight 4 points which were omnipresent throughout the discussion for the benefit of the audience present here. Is that the predicament that the community faces today is not just just does not stem out of from a place of stigma. It stems out of a place where the body was pathologized to an extent where certain type of body differences were depicted as deviance, or like in a language of alienation, or like the body was termed as an alien or a aberration. And that pathologization still remains very omnipresent in our present conversation or treatment of gender non-conforming communities in India. The second point which I tried to highlight in the discussion was the role of information control. Whenever we talk about political realities and political tensions, we very uncritically leave out how information plays a fundamental role in how we imagine social interactions, which also forms the base of democratic solidarities or solidarities aimed at rights. Information control on gender has been so strong in India, not just with the onset of colonial rule, but even before colonial rule, to hold on to traditional forms of household and governance, that information or lack of information also impedes the ability of a lot of marginalized people to even articulate their rights in the first place. And that's why I want to like critically highlight the role of information control, which sociologist George Simmel also talks about. The third point which I want to highlight on, which generally the conversations from the grassroots is generally like marred with, is this politics of bare minimum. Any conversation on rights or furthering of rights in the present time often falls into this discourse of uh, being subordinate to the benevolence of the state. However, n- this benevolence is not often critically assessed to highlight how these benevolence sometimes are nothing but bare minimum uh, efforts taken at a post-dated time. And this is what has been the case with the NALSA judgment translating into the Transgender Protection of Rights Act 2019, and the act not translating to anything in 2023. And the last point that I would like to highlight on or come back to, which finds a mention in the title in itself: what remains of freedom in a democracy? Basically, here I would like to conclude with one line: the idea of democracy is often talked about in the line of equality, coming together as equals. But the line which connects this equality is the idea of freedom. When one person's idea of freedom becomes the template for everyone to imagine their own freedom, is where the project or the entire idea of democracy uh, goes through a free fall. And that's why when we talk about freedom, freedom also needs to be articulated in a plural form, in in forms which has not been like mainstreamed in the current academia or in current organizations uh, which delve into activism or who work in the field of human rights. That's why I would like to conclude that when we like treat freedom as a guiding principle, this guiding principle also needs to make a room for the plural nature of freedom, so that a lot of people who do not find mentions in history, mentions in law, or mentions in our social interactions in dignified ways, have our own stories to tell about freedom and our own possibilities to imagine when we talk about freedom. And on that note, I think like Professor Biswajit, you won't be needing to like remind me about the time. I think I'm done. And back to you.
Thank you, Vaibhav. This is very, very interesting exposition of theory, and they would try to deconstruct the whole knowledge system that we have been imbibed with. And you brought in the whole question of exception and governmentality, how the state uses the technique to manipulate our body and understand our body also. And one thing that I would like to add into that your theoretical understanding of movement and freedom and democracy is how this exception plays what is called necropolitics. That means you are allowed to live, but simultaneously you are not accepted into the societal realm. So that necropolitics is also playing an important part in this whole theory of exception. Okay, stating that, let me invite Nikhil Jain as our next speaker. Nikhil? Yeah, Nikhil. Just, can you just, hello?
Yeah, is it audible? I was
Yes,
just trying to connect myself.
yes. Just title, say your title and then your paper.
Okay. The title of my paper is Disability Rights Movement and Challenges and Responses. Primarily, before coming up to this conference, I was thinking how to put myself in the whole spectrum. And being a disabled activist and also, who have lived a disability as well as not only as a person but also in activism, I decided to talk more about the struggles, more about trade union movements as well as judicial activism that have been a part of disability rights movement in India particularly. And before 1995 Act as well as post Person with Disabilities Act also. Let me also introduce myself. One important thing which was left, I think, rather skipped in the introduction, that I also belong to a disabled persons organization called Sambhavna, which is working for the rights of disabled. And primarily it started its work in Delhi University. Now it's a national body. So being a part of it, I had been exposed to several judicial as well as trade union activism. So my paper, or my presentation rather, would focus upon how disability rights movement evolved in India, particularly in 1980s and 1990s, because that was a time when there was no legislation in disability rights movement. And whatever was coming from the state was merely out of charity or out of tokenism, or maybe there were certain demands being made on certain influential people. Disability rights movement perhaps started in India in 1980, but one can find some sort of presence or some sort of some sort of reflection of disability rights movement in India even in 1970s. And the primary reason for this was in 1973, the United Nations declared 9th December as the World Disability Day. When General Assembly of United Nations passed it in its annual meeting, which also affected India as it is also a part of United Nations body. And in 1970 also was a time when several urban-based intellectuals, particularly lawyers or intelligentsia or even scholars, got together and formed certain organizations, namely National Federation of the Blind, and also later which is called All India Confederation of the Blind. Here I also wish to state that disability rights movement in India was primarily launched by the visually challenged people, unlike in other countries like US. Like if you read Joseph P. Shapiro's book No Pity, which provides the historical accounts on disability rights movement in US, where one finds that many categories of person with disabilities, like whether it is locomotive disabilities or visually challenged or hearing impaired, they have had tremendous participation in whether it is trade union as well as other forms of movements. And there was one very clear account which he gave, narrated in his book, where there was a Congress in session, and people, particularly from all parts of walks of disability, they were jumping on the stairs and they were saying that, there cannot be any legislation for us without us. So that was, I think, one of the major remarkable movements or historical movements that disability rights have witnessed, particularly in US. But nothing of that sort happened in India. And in 1980, we witnessed the first ever demonstration launched by the National Federation of the Blind in March, when they proceeded to the Prime Minister House for certain demands on education and employment. And in employment, there was no scope for a person with disabilities, and the only jobs which were considered to be fit for person with disabilities, either in Group C or D, and they were also very, very minimal. But apparently, there was a declaration by UN to celebrate 1981 as the International Year for Person with Disabilities, and that was one of the reasons that awared not only the Indian government but also civil society for the significance of disability as a movement or disability as an issue also. So in 1980, the NFB started its movement, particularly Mr. Santosh Shomta, and I think he also was able to meet the Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, and the offshoot of it was the formation of several committees, particularly in Lal Advani and then other committees. And there was a bill also introduced in Rajya Sabha on the rights of persons with disabilities, particularly in employment. But that was not being passed. Yes. And then there was a committee under the chairmanship of the retired Justice Behrul Islam. And that committee, in fact, proposed the sort of a kind of a legislation which took shape later on in 1990s, and that legislation was put before the government of India, but government took refuge in the ninth schedule, like in the state list, by saying that disability being a part of state list cannot be considered as a central legislation. So that was something, where both disability activists as well as the government was holding to, because the disability activists were making their appeal to the government to pass the disability rights, whereas the government was not allowing it to happen. But apparently, in 1990s, the international situation took a turn, and the UN also declared it a kind of an era of for celebrating the full participation and equal opportunity for the person with disabilities, particularly with Asia and Pacific. And in 1993, there was a huge conference, which was where there was participation by the government officials, the civil society, and disabled activists. And of the offshoot of it was the formation of a group, which is very famously called DRG, Disability Rights Group, where the top disability activists from all disability categories, they participated. And that was the one, I think, major movement where people from across disability came together and they formed a group. Before that, the other, all categories, all disabled organizations, they were making themselves, they were lobbying for their rights independently. Like, for instance, there was a National Federation of the Blind or Blind Persons Organization in Ahmedabad. There was All India Confederation of the Blind, or even Javed Abidi's National Center for Promotion of Employment and for the Disabled Persons. All these groups and were basically dealing with their specific disabilities. And for the first time in 1994, we found that a group across all disability came together and was able to influence government to come up with the legislation in the parliament. And the result was the passage of 1995 Person with Disabilities Act, Equal Opportunity Protection of Rights and Full Participation Act, which was a landline how we see the Person with Disabilities Act in 1995. And after the passage of 1995 Act, we found the disability rights movement took a turn to move to the judicial activism, because now they were thinking that now we have a right, we have a legislation, and that legislation needs government is bound to abide by the legislation. So they moved towards the judiciary, and it took a lot of time. The passage of 1995 did not mean that everything was done, everything was ready for the disabled to enjoy, to be protected of. Rather, they have a very long battle after that in the court of law, and several cases were filed, particularly in the area of reservation, because reservation was a key which was there in the Person with Disabilities Act. And the one remarkable change which I think the Person with Disability Act brought was that prior to Person with Disabilities Act, the jobs which were available for disabled were only in Group C and D. But after that, the Group A and B were also open, as it was clearly mentioned in the Act also. So there was high hopes in all, whether in universities, whether in legal field or banks or all sectors, that now the government jobs are open. But it was not so easy for disabled to to seek reservation or to seek the mandate which was given through the PWD Act in their favor. So several court cases were found, and many organizations were also, one may say, came into existence. And one major thing which happened was that before the PWD Act, there was only few categories of disabled who were very vocal, who were very loud on the streets, also in the speaking to the government, also in the press, also. But primarily the visually challenged lobby, the body, as well as to some extent the orthopedically challenged. Orthopedically challenged, who were they were part of many, they were fortunate to have jobs in many fields, because apparently they were not considered to be as disabled as other categories of the disabled, visually challenged or the hearing impaired. But later on, we found that many organizations working for other categories of disabled also came into existence, and they also started lobbying for their own rights. And few of them were managed by the Disabled Persons Organization. There were many books which gave account of these, particularly the Ali Bakar's and Anjali Sharma's book, or G.N. Karna's book. One very interesting argument which was built by like Jagdish Chandra also, and also that in 1980s, the movement which was launched in India, primarily which was launched by a visually challenged movement, was could not succeed much in the initial years, but only due to the international pressure and maybe with the get-together of the Disabled Rights Group, I think the passage of 1995 Act was there. The Nilika Malhotra in her article on disability rights movement in India, she categorically talks about the three kinds of disability rights movement. Like one particularly managed by or launched by the urban-based lawyers and intellectuals who formed their groups like National Federation of the Blind. Others was those NGOs or those groups which were not managed by disabled persons, but they were working for the person with disabilities, like we can see ADI or Action for Autism, etc., etc. And there were other also like groups or platforms which were present in universities, like where the scholarship on disability was there to some extent initially. Now we can find it in several ways, and like there were disability studies groups and other disability related activities in the university. So with the turn of the century, we found that the several court cases they came in, were filed, and many of them we had got judgment acknowledging the 3% reservation, and also directing the state bodies to provide the 3% reservation which was there in the Person with Disabilities Act. But the question was that how to influence or how to implement this or how to force the state bodies to implement this. And I have a very clear example in Delhi University where after the Pushkar Singh versus Delhi University case, we were having very high hopes that now the court has asked Delhi University to fill in the 3% reservation in 6 months. But there have been years and nothing happened. So what DU used to do, that they used to write at the bottom of every advertisement that 3% reservation is applicable, but they never implemented the 3% reservation. So then I think we realized that the core of implementation of reservation is roster, and on that pretext, I think the Sambhavna, which started in it's working in 2000 on the issue of reservation in employment, filed a case, a very famous case in Delhi against Delhi University in 2006, where roster became a key for implementation of 3% reservation. And I think in the history, for the first time in the history of India, that court has put a stay on all appointments in Delhi University in 2007, in April 2007, by asking Delhi University to first clear the backlog of 3%, to implement the 3% reservation first, then on all other categories would be open. And I clearly recall one of the hearing that I was part of, that Justice Thakur was asking their lawyers. They were asking the judge to open the appointment for all. The judge was simply saying that you give us 3%, we'll give you rest of the 97. So that was how I think the proactive approach of judiciary cannot be forgotten. But the situation is not so rosy actually in all cases. Like for instance, in one of the case where Abdul Shah versus Medical Council of India, very interestingly, he was asking for the equality of percentage of marks or parity of marks with the SC, ST and other backward classes. But the judge was of the opinion that since there is no protection of person with disability specifically in the Constitution in Article 1516, so there cannot be a parity maintained. And I think that was a time that we took up this case that sadly, after the fact that there was so many legislation, that there is a Person with Disabilities Act or Rights of Person with Disabilities Act 2016, but there is no mention of disability or disabled in the Constitution. There is only one reference in Article 40, but otherwise there is no mention. There were specific mentions of SC, ST and other women, but there is no mention. So we had also launched a online signature campaign in 2010 with Professor Upendra Bakshi to be the initial signatories. And prior to that also, when I think the Constitutional Review Committee was formed with Justice Chalaya, perhaps, there also we submitted a draft that, this is an important thing that perhaps the framers of the Constitution skipped, including person with disabilities in the Constitution. So there is a time, and so this was the case. But after that, I think the post Person with Disabilities Act, we also witnessed a very important thing, disability passage of disability policy by the government of India, and that occurred because there was a huge roar in the disability sector that nothing is happening despite this landmark legislation. So government wanted to give a direction to all its bodies through the passage of this policy, by particularly in the education, in employment, and also in accessibility. But disability policy cannot be called as a civil rights entity or maybe a political rights thing, because it was only talking about the socio-economic benefits to be given to the person with disabilities. However, it was I think an important initiative by the government, and the following year they also came with another important thing, that was the incentive given to the private players to provide employment to the person with disability in terms of tax benefits, and that was one of the major things, because private bodies were not giving employment to the person with disabilities on several grounds. Maybe how will they manage, on account of inefficiency, or on account of the extra budget to be kept for them for giving or enabling them to work efficiently, etc., etc. But that tax exemption or incentive, I think, proved to be a very boon, because in many people started to hire, big companies started to hire the disabled persons later on. And in universities also, we found that particularly in DU, because other university, I don't think that has set such a glorious record as DU now, as having, I think, more than 90% people being absorbed or being given jobs against a reservation. Like Sambhavna filed cases against JNU and other universities, and UGC also, which are still going on. Another important thing which I also would like to share with you is the the UPSC, which is a premium body, was not giving reservation to disabled, and there was a serious lobbying as well as a fight, not only on the street but also again in the judiciary. And one of the I think case where Sambhavna filed against the UPSC, which where we had judgment in 2014, where UPSC was directed to give reservation, adequate reservation, they said, because they were giving less reservation. They were giving it due to pressure, but they were not giving the full reservation. So they're trying to save certain seats. So then the court asked the judiciary to, the court asked the UPSC to give full reservation, which was a 3% reservation, and also clear the backlog. And in 1 year, the UPSC was forced to fill up around 54 seats. That was, I think, historic and for any body, so far the UPSC is concerned, to give reservation in seats. The trade union activities, although I would say got a bit thinned down, or maybe not so present as was witnessed in before 1995, but we found that in some places the trade union activities were also visible. And one of the major area where I found the trade union activity was universities now, be it Delhi University or JNU. Like in Delhi University, we were there, and in JNU Visually Challenged Forum, and other like several local rural organizations managed by persons with disabilities, like Jharkhand Netrahin Kalyan Manch, or in Chhattisgarh there was a organization, I'm just forgetting the name, and many other organizations, the grassroots organization. However, they're not so effective, but they made their themselves visible in many respects in the launching campaign against those state governments. And also many, as a consequence, big organizations like NCEPUD of Javed Abidi, now late Javed Abidi, now I think Arman Ali is managing that, and also who started the scholarship for youth and all, and many other organizations like the National Federation of the Blind they are forced
Nikhil,
yes,
could you
okay,
just
wrap
up, yeah.
Something that
thank you. So they were forced to move to the rural areas, and
actually I'm using
as a result, the government was also
actually studying
forced
the RTI
think
movement and also
working for rural areas, particularly the Department of Empowerment of Persons with
I'm not
Disabilities,
actually very
which recently has started a campaign for the rural disabled in the shelter, as well as there is a body called National Handicap Finance Development Corporation, which gives funding to the person with disabilities for the self-employment and other things like aids and appliances. But the rural disabled were always deprived of it because of lack of awareness and etc. other things. So now they were also forced to work on this.
They were not getting goods.
Since time is up, but there are certain things where I find that the RPD, which was passed in 2016, is considered to be, I think, more progressive in terms of bringing disability to be an issue of human rights. Because the Person with Disabilities Act in 1995, although it was a great achievement in terms of disability legislation, but it was still considered to be a reflection of medical model of disability. Now, the RPD Act 2016 is considered to be, I think, a way forward to give a disability human rights approach by making disability a social, like bringing disability into the social model. But still, there are several areas where I think disability rights movement needs to focus on. Like one of the major areas is the political inclusion of disabled. And I find that it's a very important thing that whether it is political parties or the legislative bodies, the inclusion of disabled is not at all visible. And I experienced it when I contested the academic council election in Delhi University, that it was very hard to convince the intelligentsia, the scholars, the disabled, the university fraternity about disability as an issue at par with the other issues of marginalization, education, academics, etc., etc. Other important thing which I think needs to be worked on the accessibility, which is an old issue but needs to be worked on very extensively, and also the constitution, where I think the disabled had to work, they have to fight for their rights to be part of Indian constitution. I think with that I rest my case and will be happy to respond, because so many things which I wanted to share.